democracy, voting rights, criminal justice reform, immigration, and preemption is a huge issue that we care about. And so I facilitate in the state legislature cross-issue coalition of various organizations who are all focused on the collective goal of stopping the abuse of preemption at the state level. So preemption is a very it's a funny topic because that phrase preemption doesn't really make any sense to anybody, right? When you talk about preemption, most folks sort of have a look of cluelessness because it's not a term we hear a lot in our day-to-day jargon. It's not a very sexy or exciting term, right? When you think about all the various policy issues that we all talk about and we advocate on, preemption is not the one that's a hot button issue, right? But it needs to be because it's something that very, very much the corporations, the special interests in the legislature are very keen on preemption, and it's a really key way that they influence our local democracy and line their pockets. So just to go over a little bit of stuff here. So again, preemption is a key policy issue that impacts every single constituency group. It serves as a unique unifying force. So I want to emphasize that term that it's a unique unifying force. There's very few other issues that bring together all the various stakeholders that preemption would that typically sometimes may not be aligned, right? So I think about, and we'll dig a little bit deeper into the last legislative session and things to expect this upcoming legislative session, which officially starts in January, but committee meetings have already convened. So lawmakers are already up in the Capitol, filing bills, voting on bills in committee, and so forth. But preemption is a very unique issue because it brings together folks who, at the local level, may not be aligned, right? But a lot of the groups that I will advocate for at the local level, we're fighting for things like, wage theft ordinances, when it wasn't preemption to the state minimum wage ordinances, things like that. Things that sometimes some of our county commissioners and city council members may not actually like, right? I mean, those are issues that we sometimes have to fight for at the local level as well. But what those county and city commissioners and what advocates all agree on is that we have a right to fight for those things at the local level. The state should not be deciding that for us. And so it's such a funny issue because when it comes to preemption, I joke with some of our allies because it's like, we typically don't come together on some of these issues, but in the state capitol, we're working hand in hand because we know we have this right at the local level to craft communities that reflect our values. The other thing I want to highlight is, right now our legislature is dominated by Republicans, right? Republican House, Republican Senate, Republican governor, and so a lot of these issues are very much the priorities of leadership, which in this current climate are Republicans, but by no means are Democrats immune to the abuse of preemption and certainly the influence of corporations in the legislative process and profit driven over people. Democrats are also very much impacted by that, so I just want to make sure that's clear. But in this current climate, the folks calling the shots are certainly Republicans, because they are in control in the legislature. But this is something that oftentimes surpasses party. And it's very much about the centralized control in the Capitol. So again, the abuse of preemption allows corporate interests to circumvent local governments by focusing lobby efforts on a small number of state lawmakers, centralize the control at the state level for profit. So think about the hundreds of local governments that we have across the state of Florida versus the 160 state lawmakers who all convene over a short period of time in the state legislature, right? So if you're an interest group, if you're a business, if you're a corporation, if you have lobbying power, you'll want to leverage that power at the state level, pass one sweeping law that will ensure that you can fulfill your shareholders' mission in communities, rather than lobbying every single local government, right? So preemption for some of the largest corporations in Florida is a really key tool that they can use to quickly and effectively leverage power and again pass state laws that benefit them. So it's a lot easier to lobby 160 lawmakers to donate to their campaigns, to support them, at the state level versus doing every single local government, which is why the abuse of preemption is a tool we often see that a lot of corporations support. And some of those key trade groups that we see, the Chamber of Commerce, the Associated Industries of Florida, the Retail Federation, the Restaurant Association, a lot of these groups are those lobby groups, those trade groups that are lobbying in the Capitol for these type of preemption bills. And again, like, I am not here, I would never demonize any grouper, and I want to emphasize the nuances in the legislative process. On immigration, for example, the Chamber of Commerce is an ally of ours in a lot of ways. On LGBTQ issues, the Chamber is often an ally. But on preemption, my colleagues in the Chamber and I often butt heads because, again, they see a clear advantage in lobbying state lawmakers on the policies that they know will support the profit margins of their businesses, oftentimes at the expense of our local democracy and some of our most basic fundamental rights. So, again, for me, it's really about following the money trail, and a lot of this will be revealed, and looking into who's registered to lobby for what, and that reveals quite a lot as well. And we'll go into a little bit of that. So again, what preemption is when higher level governments pass laws restricting the policy authority of lower level governments, right? So there's certain things that are preempted to the federal government, the state can't act on. There's certain things that are preempted at the state level that local governments can't act on. There are good preemptions when the federal government or the state set base level protections that lower governments may use as a starting point. So I give some examples, right? The environmental standards. It is completely necessary, acceptable, it makes total sense that the federal government or the state government will set very basic environmental protections that everybody must follow, right? That makes perfect sense as the purpose of, state and federal government, right? So they're setting a baseline of protections that then local governments can build off of, right? States can build off of. You see that there's basic federal protections on the environment, but different states and counties and cities may build off of those in their communities, right? With non-discrimination policies, LGBTQ non-discrimination, right? We actually are, we support a statewide non-discrimination policy, which would update Florida's Civil Rights Code to include gender identity and sexual orientation. That would be a preemption, right? That would be one, blanket protection for everybody. That is the point of preemption, to set a baseline of protections. And the fact that we don't have a statewide non-discrimination law is a disservice to the safety and well-being of our state, right? And we have a lot of local, of course, non-HROs, human rights ordinances that have passed when the state has an act. Local governments have put these forth. But that would be an example of a good and necessary preemption because it sets a basic baseline of protections. Same with public health and safety standards as well, right? Think about all the different rules and regulations around, restaurants and food and garbage collection, things like that. And again, local governments can build off of that, adapt to their communities, but there's some basic, protections that the state and the federal government have a purpose to put forth. So those are, reasonable good preemptions, right? What we see often in the legislature is abuse of preemption. So increasingly, corporate interests are using preemption to systematically strip local governments of their power to protect the health and safety of their communities, to decide how to use their own money, personnel, and resources, to overturn local ballot initiatives. We currently see that with the lawsuit, and we talk to our small businesses, and they're all in support, and everyone loves it. We can't do it. Our hands are tied. Wage theft ordinances, we do have those in Florida, and they're very, it's county by county, city by city, and they're very effective, particularly with working people and immigrant communities who often see their wages, they're not fully compensated for the work that they do. The state of Florida does not have a Department of Labor, so our local municipalities have to take that into our own hands. Last session, we saw a bill that would preempt wage theft ordinances in Florida. We were able to stop that bill. That is something that a lot of these big corporations want to see stripped away from local governments. Gun safety, another big one, right? It's a current lawsuit out of Tallahassee, and several mayors have joined, including Mayor Buddy Dyer. Right now, local governments can't regulate gun policies at the local level. We can't ban guns in parks and things like that. That is preempted to the state of Florida. Again, immigrants, the big anti-immigrant bill last session, Senate Bill 168, which became law, that bill requires even higher standards of law enforcement collaboration with immigrant customs enforcement than even federal law. And the state passed that. The state preempted local law enforcement's ability to work with the federal government when it comes to immigration enforcement, and now local law enforcement are required to sign on to federal programs, required to use their best efforts to support ICE, and that is the state legislature preempting local government's authority on working with federal immigration enforcement. And the list goes on and on. Civil rights, they passed a law last session putting the legal damages. So any local government that wants to sue the state on preemption, they now have to pay the legal fees. The environment, of course, some of the stuff we saw last session, which we're going to see again, banning sunscreen ordinances. So some local governments, particularly coastal communities, are passing local laws to ban certain types of sunscreen. And so Johnson & Johnson, family company, they really opposed this bill. You know that because their lobby team has signed up to lobby against it. And for them, banning certain brands of sunscreen are going to impact their profits, right? And so they have put their whole lobby team against this bill. They to pass the bill because they essentially want to ban local governments from being able to ban certain sunscreens, right? And so again, rather than them going to local governments and lobbying, they go to the state and they advocate there. They donate to folks' campaigns. They donate to different PACs, things like that. And they want to strip away the rights of local governments to protect our coastal communities because it'll impact their bottom line. And it's hilarious how much in the state legislature is so much connected to profits, to the corporate agenda, the corporations influencing lawmakers, and then serving those special interests over the will of the voters. I can tell you time and time again how many times we see that it becomes laughable. But going down this again, LGBTQ equality. So those human rights ordinances, conversion therapy bans, right? Those are at the local level. Reproductive rights, things around contraception, education, access to contraception, animal advocacy, so puppy mills. Think about the local bans on puppy mills. Those are, again, a local government issue that we've seen potentially impacted by state legislation. And again, local governments, we'll go into some more of he knows much better all the various nuances around our local governments, but they're also, of course, impacted by preemption. And you, all of us, our basic, not only is it, our local democracy at stake, our ability to influence government closest to us, but also our everyday lives are impacted by all these things, right? And so when I talk about preemption being this unifying force, these are all the various entities that don't typically always come together, but on preemption we do. So the American Heart Association, the American Cancer Association is standing side by side with Equality Florida, with AFL-CIO and SVIU, with the Humane Society and the ASPCA. We all come together during the legislative session to combat some of these major preemption bills. And what were some of those bills? So last session, more than 35 preemption bills were filed. The majority did not move, and in no small part toward advocacy. Some of those with momentum. So House Bill 3. House Bill 3 was what we call a Death Star bill. We call it that because it's basically a sweeping piece of preemption. This bill would literally prohibit any and all business regulation at the local level, and then repeal all current ones by 2020. So thinking about, right. Yes. So think about every type of business regulation, which would include actually human rights ordinances, with local ordinances to prohibit discrimination on the LGBTQ community. But every type, puppy mills, everything I talked about, this bill would have prohibited and repealed. It's just an absurd idea. But it moved through committees, and we mobilized around it. We were able to get it amended down to essentially a licensing bill where it had a very small, limited scope, and it did pass, but not in its original version. But these type of bills we see typically every session. We haven't seen it yet, this coming one, but would have devastating effects on our all the different constituency groups we talked about, and again our local democracy. Senate Bill 432, that was a preemption of predictive scheduling, which actually does not exist in Florida. Apparently, San Francisco passed predictive scheduling, which essentially requires restaurants to put forth their schedule ahead of time for their employees, right? Which is not a ridiculous idea, but the Restaurant Association got wind of it, and so they put forth a bill that would preempt something that does not exist yet in Florida. And then in the amendment process, the bill actually also preempted wage step ordinances, which again we do have in Florida, and we were able to mobilize and stop that bill from passage. House Bill 1299, we call that a train bill. It had over 7+ preemptions combined that include banning bans of plastic straws, as well as some repealing or overruling local ordinances on tobacco products and things of that nature. That bill did actually pass, and Governor DeSantis actually vetoed it. He's trying to have this mantra of being a pro-environmental Republican, right? And so banning bans of plastic straws did not go well with that. So he did veto that bill. Some of the other things that we saw that did not move. So a representative of the Panhandle filed a ban on removing Confederate statues. We also saw the legislature attempt to increase the threshold to pass local tax referendums, right? So right now, it's majority rules. They want to raise it to like 66% to pass local tax referendum. And the list goes on and on. All the various ideas they have of how they can continue chopping away at local government. We were able to weaken the anti-immigrant bill, which was a top priority of the governor, so we were able to narrow its scope, although it still did pass. And we also were able to narrow the scope of a bill that would essentially originally ban all inclusionary housing ordinances, which essentially would require developers to build mixed-income housing. We were able to water down that bill, but still it did pass. So when we look at the 2019 legislative session, there were a few key things we saw, right? And I named some of the corporations that we see influence, and a lot of them are ones that we know and love, right? So Johnson & Johnson, again, they constantly put forth they're trying to ban bans on sunscreen. The styrofoam ban. So at local level, we cannot ban styrofoam. That's Publix doing all of that. Disney's behind a lot of this stuff. A lot of these big corporations, a lot of these brands that we know, we love, and we shop at, and we support, they are leveraging their influence in the state legislature to preempt various, local efforts for us to make our communities reflect our values. So that they can make profits, right? Which is their mission, right? Like we get that, but not at our expense, right? And so when we look back at the preemption bills, but also a lot of the bills, the massive corporate tax package that passed, a lot of stuff last session that went through, the sort of three key themes that I reflect on. We saw a lot of bills that serve corporate donors and their special interests, right? And for elected officials who have to run every 2 years and every 4 years, that's important that their donors have money to give back to them, right? We saw stifling of democracy at the state and local level. So again, various preemption bills, the Amendment 4 implementation bill, which is very much restrictive, and also efforts to limit constitutional amendments at the state level as well. And then energizing conservative base. We saw that with the anti-immigrant bill, very much a racist bill. We saw that with legislation around women's reproductive health care, right? And so you see a lot of these efforts in the legislature. It's very much designed to secure power in that process. And so, when you follow the money and look at who's donating and who's lobbying for what and all those various money trails, it becomes pretty clear that corporations are running Tallahassee over people, right? And my role is to try to put a wedge in that and stop that process alongside a lot of other really awesome people and lawmakers and champions for us. So again, just in summary, a couple more slides, and we'll be done. The effect of state interference in local decision making is to void the will of local voters and lock out entire groups from participating fully in our democracy. Local governments, local voters, and local residents have lost power in every legislative session since 2011. While local power can be used to block as well as advance equity-promoting policies, at present the erosion of local authority means that innovative and problem-solving policies have been stopped in many states. So we see this trend all over the country of preemption bills. A lot of it is linked to, those, to national efforts, interest think tanks like ALEC and things like that, right? You see a lot of these model legislations come through. So we're seeing trends across the country. And it's smart, it's very innovative, right? Of some of these big players, again, to lobby a small number of state lawmakers in the Capitol versus going to local governments individually. And this argument that we can't have a patchwork of policies policies because it'll make Florida anti-business and will harm our economy. You know, local governments want to stimulate their economy, right? Like we all want jobs and we want innovation and things like that. So when you empower local governments to do that, it'll lead to that. And there are certainly bad actors in local governments, and those folks should be held accountable. But preemption is not that, and you'll see that a lot where state lawmakers will sort of try to demonize local governments with saying like they've gone out of control and things like that. And it's far from the truth, and quite frankly, you know, a lot of those rights that local governments have been eroded and are already preempted to the state. So just a few, you know, takeaways from last session. You know, we've really started to organize our preemption efforts to combat the abuse of preemption and to really educate folks on what it is and how it impacts us. So, you know, we actually, some of the immigration advocates were declared winners of Florida politics, even though for us, the bill's passage was, you know, devastating and harm our communities. The original version of the bill, for any local government who essentially said that they were not going to coordinate with ICE beyond what federal law requires, which is, you know, what some folks call a sanctuary city, which is such a loaded term and not accurate. But the original bill that was filed literally would require for any government that was following federal law and just going, and that was their, not going above that, would be fined $5,000 a day, and the government could remove them from office. And again, no government was violating federal law when it comes to working with ICE, but the Senate Bill 168 requires more strenuous compliance with immigrant customs enforcement. And so we were able to water down that bill, but that's just one example of some of the draconian proposals that the legislature puts forth to retaliate and punish local governments for serving their purpose. Again, we saw some headlines. Florida Republicans are going to war against small government. Should state legislatures override local decisions? Cities and counties say no. So, you know, you see this issue, preemption, gets some more headlines, but it's a challenge to communicate it with, you know, everyday people because it's so wonky. And so we're really working to do events like this, of course, but communicate with folks, you know, who's really in charge in the legislature, and how we can, you know, get our power back in that process. So again, just in some, you know, countermeasure, we are seeing some progress, if you can believe that, in this work. The bills we were able to stop were pretty substantial, right? Stopping that Death Star bill, watering down some preemption bills, that's a pretty good symbol. We're seeing some really amazing champions, state lawmakers, Democrats and Republicans who are starting to stand up against preemption bills, which is wonderful. We really want to make it a nonpartisan issue, because again, it's not about partisanship, it's about power, and it's about serving the will of the people and not special interests, right? So we're seeing cross-issue coalitions, preemption repeal measures, the emergence of new state and local champions, altering efforts to strengthen local democracy, and efforts to repeal corporations and money behind the abuse of preemption is critical. Because, you know, a lot of these, you know, brands, of course, and, you know, don't get me wrong, I shop at Target, I don't shop at Publix, but I shop at other grocery stores. And, you know, what they have is a brand, and a lot of these big, you know, these corporations will pay the Chamber of Commerce, the Associated Industries of Florida, these trade groups, you know, they pay them an annual fee, so they go do their dirty work for them in the legislature, right? So you don't see those kind of brands often associated with some of these policies. But when you start following the money trail, doing some, you know, deeper research, you start to see the various corporations behind a lot of these preemption bills. And so when you start to reveal that and talk to the brands, then they're in a panic, right? That's what they are in their brands. And so when people start to realize Publix doesn't want us to have medical cannabis, but Publix doesn't want us to have styrofoam bans, like what is going on with Publix, right? They start to scale back. They go to their lawmakers and say, oh, remember that? Like, cut that. We're not going to do that anymore, right? And so we do empowering this, right? It's about effectively advocating for these issues and communicating what preemption is. And again, every state, every community in the state is different. Their populations, demographic makeups, economies are all different. Local government exists to build communities that reflect the diversity in our unique needs, and the legislature has often worked to stifle that. And again, it's for a special interest that stands to benefit from that. So what can you do? I would not end this without an ask, right? So we're fortunate here in Orange County in particular to have some really amazing lawmakers, state senators, and state representatives urging your folks to put you over corporate influence will make a big difference. And that's preemption for you. There you go.
All right. Next up, we have Rick Geller.
Do you know how to set this up?
No, I'm going to take it.
Yeah.
You only have done
Do you know how to set it up?
Oh, yeah. Please mind my...
So while he's setting that up, I really appreciate that perspective, and I also appreciate that biodegradable styrofoam as well. And just for the record, I came here and then showed people to grow all electric. But I represent a number of small cities here in Central Florida, so my perspective comes from them. And I also appreciate saying this is very much a bipartisan issue, because I have commissioners who are Republicans who sit on our city councils and city commissions who are very, very concerned about this, who are very concerned about the abusive removal of home rule. And home rule is the ability of our cities, our counties, to govern themselves locally. I want to give you a little bit of background. So here's the original Constitution of the state of Florida. And in that Constitution, it was the legislature who was given the power to establish municipalities and to determine the powers of those municipalities. Now, what that meant was that municipalities couldn't do much of anything unless the state legislature gave them permission to do it. And that and so what happened is you ended up with a bunch of local bills. Year after year, you have thousands of requests, like in Tallahassee, to allow our cities to do things. All these local, 2,107 local bills in 1965 alone. They were getting inundated up there. And so something had to change. And so in 1968, Florida voters amended the Constitution. And so now it says municipalities shall have governmental, corporate, and proprietary powers. The government can actually open a business, proprietary powers, to enable them to conduct municipal government, perform municipal functions, and render municipal services. Now here's where the power was retained. And they exercise any power for municipal purposes, except as otherwise provided by law. So the legislators in Tallahassee retained that power ultimately, which we're seeing exercised now. So the original response wasn't so great when matters were taken to the courts. The courts would rule often against cities, against home rule. And so in 1973, we then had the Municipal Home Rule Powers Act. And this was to try to eliminate some of the judicial restrictions on home rule. And so here, the statute said the purpose is to extend municipalities the exercise of powers for municipal, corporate, proprietary purposes not expressly prohibited by the Constitution, general, special law, or county charter, and to remove any limitations judicially imposed. So that was to take care of the judges who are not letting cities flex their muscle and to engage in home rule. And so we'll just get through some of these. Now there are two kinds of preemption. There's express preemption and there's implied preemption. We'll talk about both of them. And also, you cannot have a local ordinance that conflicts with state law. We'll talk about that just a little bit. And so the express preemption can be partial or can be complete. There are some various examples of that. 5G. So this is the latest thing I'm hearing about, that our city commissioners and council members are getting emails from citizens concerned about the electromagnetic effects of 5G. And 5G, you will see these new antennas going on top of street lights and power poles and other places. Well, sometimes it's actually beneficial for local officials not to have to deal with some of these things. And this is one of those examples here, where the Federal Communications Act itself is a federal preemption. They federally preempt this out of local control. No state or local government may regulate the placement, construction, or modification of personal wireless service facilities on the basis of the environmental effects of radio frequency emissions. And so our our local council members don't need to worry about, oh my gosh, is this a real threat? Is it not? Is it fluff science? It's preempted. This is what some of those antennas might look like, very aesthetically unpleasing. This was the Advanced Wireless Infrastructure Deployment Act that was approved a couple years ago. This is an example of express preemption, except as provided in the subsection authority meaning a county or municipality, may not prohibit, regulate, or charge for the co-location of small wireless facilities in the public right of way. So in this session, there's this discussion of corporations trying to protect their profits. In this case, Verizon and AT&T went to the state legislature and said, we would like to put our new 5G antennas in the public rights of way along all the streets. And we would like to pay cities and counties the grand total of $150 a year for the privilege of doing it. There's some other constitutional issues with that. And so we are prohibited from charging fair market rent for the use of our rights of way. But the preemption is partial because the legislature does allow cities to regulate objective design criteria for these antennas. And so for a couple of our cities, we said we don't want what's on the left, but we do like what's on the right. So if you can give us decorative street lamps that have your antennas in them that look nice like the one on the right, have at it. Come on into our city. The medical marijuana was an interesting bit of preemption because, well, on one hand, the state legislature said you must treat medical marijuana dispensaries just as you would CVS or Walgreens or any kind of pharmacy. If you don't want to do that, you can't have them in your city whatsoever. So it was like, okay, it's like all or nothing. Some of our cities felt that they wanted a more nuanced approach, but they would want to regulate them differently from a typical pharmacy. Some said, come on in, and we'd love to have you. The citizens voted on this, have at it, and besides, I'm kind of getting old and creaky, and what I did in the 1960s, kind of worked then. I'd like to try it now. Personally, I don't do that, but some people do. So firearms was mentioned by Ida. No smoking ordinances. One thing that urbanists love is outdoor dining. Outdoor dining, just make a place. This is downtown Winter Garden. Just a wonderful place to spend a Saturday or Sunday morning on the West Orange Trail, stopping by there. But the city cannot regulate smoking there. That is something that is regulated from above. Or you can voluntarily ask restaurants to regulate it. So implied preemption is the next subsection I want to inform you about. And so in this case, if there is a statutory scheme that is so widespread, it is apparent from that scheme that preemption is implied. That's what is meant here. This is language from a Florida Supreme Court case about that. So for an example, public records. Public records is something that is regulated at the state level, and the legislature has so thoroughly regulated that area that would not be appropriate for a local government to try to regulate what is or is not a public record, and the requirements for disclosing those public records to somebody who wants them. So that's implied preemption. There's no express preemption like we saw in the Wireless Act. I will say that implied preemption is narrowly construed, at least according to one Supreme Court justice, and we fought some of these bills over implied preemption. Conflicts of law. If to comply with one law at the local level, you must violate a law at the state level. Can't do that. That's a conflict that we want to allow. And then under the Florida Constitution, there are certain areas that the municipality just cannot regulate whatsoever, including taxation, annexation, and all listed there. Okay, so some of the recent bills. Now, this one is not entirely unreasonable. Okay, to provide for uniformity of laws governing autonomous vehicles throughout the state. There's something to be said for having some kind of uniformity in the regulation of autonomous vehicles, so that you don't end up with a patchwork. Because vehicles can go from jurisdiction to jurisdictions. That might make some sense. But now, the attack on local commerce and trade regulation, I looked at the Death Star bill. And so you can just, here's the language of something you can see for yourself in black and white, that you cannot have a bill that has an adverse impact on economic growth, private sector job creation or employment, private sector investment, or business competitiveness. So you can imagine the lawsuits that would come out of that, because virtually anything done at the local level arguably might have some kind of impact on one of these areas. It's a ridiculous bill. I want to talk to you a little bit about community redevelopment agencies. This is an area that we'll probably see more attacks on this in the coming legislative session. Sometimes these things just don't go away. You might water down a bill, but they'll keep at it. They'll come back at you next year. And so CRAs, we might see this. CRA is a geographic subsection of a city or another political jurisdiction where the revenues stay in that area and is used for redevelopment purposes. So I'll share with you, this is Denning Drive. Does anyone, I think you live in Winter Park. Well, Denning Drive is a 4-lane local street where people would drive 45, 50 miles an hour. And it severed the predominantly African-American community, Campbell Square, the historic community there, from Martin Luther King Park. And so kids, to go from their neighborhood to the park, would be playing Frogger with motorists driving at high speeds. And we thought that was a bad idea. And this before I became city attorney for Winter Park. I can't advocate now to my client. It's now a different relationship. But we met with the commissioners and urged them to use CRA funding to do something about Denning Drive. And they did. And so they made a huge investment of more than $600,000. And Denning Drive went on a diet. And so instead of 4 lanes of cars just flying down, now it's 1 lane with some turn lanes and these pedestrian refuge islands. This is during the construction. People have already slowed down and get kids able to cross Denning Drive much more safely. I'll just give you another before and after example. Here's before, here's after. And it's wonderful. The CRA, it really was a vehicle for doing something really special for the community. But here we have, just a couple years ago, or last year actually, Senate Bill 1770, would have weakened local government control over CRAs, are requiring county approval of the CRA budget. So if you're a city, you can't even control your own budget. You have to go to the county. Ridiculous. Here is more like, to create a CRA, you need a supermajority vote. They'll just throw in all sorts of roadblocks. Here's an article, the Orlando Sentinel, a lawmakers target special taxing districts. A CRA was used for the Dr. Phillips Performing Arts Center. And some really good things come out of CRAs. And yet the attack continues. Here's what passed this last legislative session. There was basically a 20-year CRA sunset. So by 2039, your CRA is going away unless you're able to get it extended. Unless the governing body of the county or municipality that created the CRA approves of its continued existence by majority vote. So that's one that could have been a lot worse.
Assuming they don't go in and preempt that before they may go in and try to preempt and create a law that says they can't extend it. So
That says they have to.
I said they may go in and try to create a law that will preempt that. One caveat in there to say you know, we're gonna preempt that and say that we're still gonna control it, the majority, that local people can't vote on it to extend it.
That's right. Could happen. Could happen. Trees and vegetable gardens. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. This is an image from the city of Winter Park. We love our trees there. People know will tell you we're very, very protective of the tree canopy. Every time you have a tree that is at the end of its lifespan, the city comes down, they remove it from the right of way, and your heart still your heart drops because it's just a whole different feel. This is Senator Stubbe of Sarasota, and I don't know if he doesn't like trees, but he sure has made it a lot easier to get rid of trees. Here is what was approved this last legislative session. This is now in Florida statutes. A local government may not require a notice, application, approval, permit fee, or mitigation. It can't require you to plant new trees if you take down another tree. For the pruning, trimming, or removal of a tree on residential property, if the property owner obtains documentation from a certified arborist or Florida licensed landscape architect, the tree presents a danger to persons or property. So that's on the surface, it sounds like it could be pretty reasonable, but I would suggest that it could be subject to abuse. If you really want to get rid of that tree, you find someone, an arborist, who's willing to give you make that finding for you. I would suggest it might not be too hard to find someone who would say virtually any tree might pose a danger. And so this has created a great deal of consternation not only in Winter Park, but in other cities too that really care about their tree canopies. This was another client of ours in the area, a developer who just clear-cut a huge swath of land up there, and under the new, this happened before the passage of the new act, but under the new act, if you got an arborist to say these are all diseased, take them all out. So the concern about abuse is very real.
Did that say residential though, or was it like any type of?
Yes, he was a residential developer.
Okay, so I thought it was just a single residence, not.
And that was a huge parcel of land that was being developed for residential homes. Now, not all the offenders, when it comes to the abuse of, or maybe there may not even be abuse, depending on your perspective, but on the use of preemption. Not everyone is on one side of the aisle or the other, because this particular bill passed with sweeping majorities, large majorities of both that Senate and the House. And the Senate was 35-5, and the House 93-16, and this was to preempt regulation of vegetable gardens. Now, I will say I did not have a lot of friends who are Democrats and very liberal in outlook, and I did not hear any of them complain about this, right? But this was still preemption, and so you really have to think about it. Should vegetable gardens be regulated in Tallahassee, or is that something more appropriate to be regulated at the local level? I support vegetable gardens in the front yard. I think it's a very sensible, environmentally sustainable thing to do. Makes a lot of sense, but who ought to be making those decisions? Should Tallahassee be doing it, or should we be doing it locally? The red light camera bill, there was a question of what's going to happen this coming session. That's going to rear its head time and time again. Get rid of the red light cameras.
Dallas just did it.
I'm sorry?
Dallas, Texas just did it.
Oh, they got rid of their red light cameras?
They'll never do it in Florida.
But you know what Apopka did? That's what it's all about. Let Apopka make that decision. They don't want red light cameras. They're local elected officials who are directly responsive to the voters there. Let them make the decision.
Did they finally get rid of all of them?
They're gone at Apopka.
Because I live in Apopka.
That's their decision.
I didn't know they had gotten rid of all of them.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, we will see this. These have been disdained as tools of the devil to tax poor people. Well, just don't go for a red light, and you won't get taxed. If it really is a tax, it's a fee, it's a fine. All right. So, So here's one. I think I mentioned this here. So if a civil action is filed against a local government to challenge the adoption or enforcement of a local ordinance on the grounds that it is expressly preempted, Constitution or state law, the court shall assess and award reasonable attorney's fees and costs and damages to the prevailing party. So let me ask you all a question. So if you're able to get attorney's fees for bringing a lawsuit, what would you expect the outcome to be? What would you expect to happen? More lawsuits. Exactly, more lawsuits. So we will see more.
Now, so the question on that one is that if you win, you get the
That's right.
Or whether you win or lose is the
Prevailing party gets fees. Okay, so what can be done, and then this based upon what Ida has told us, the active communications of the state legislatures is really critical here. There can be, and the Constitution, but is that really realistic? And I'll show you an example of an effort that didn't quite make it out of the last go round when we had the Constitutional Revision Commission. Some of the arguments, though. Government closest to the people serves the people best. One size does not fit all. And I would argue to my Republican friends that home rule is very much a conservative principle. You want the people who are making decisions closest to people to be making those decisions. It's a very conservative principle.
And and also too the fact that if you don't want the federal government in your business, then why do you want the state government in your business? And that's one of the biggest Republican thoughts of process is that Big Brother is in my business, on my state level or whatever, but then the state turns around and they want to be in the local business.
That's right.
It's the
That's
same
right.
difference.
No consistency there whatsoever. Look, broad home rule makes for less work at the legislature. Issues can be handled locally as they should. Home rule allows cities to preserve their unique qualities and values, contributing to Florida's character. We talked about that with trees. Home rule allows local governments to develop and experiment with innovative legislative approaches, solving problems. And this here was a proposal. This did not go very far, but this would have been really, really nice. A law enacted by the legislature, which restricts power granted to the municipality under this subsection, must pass 2/3 vote of each house of the legislature. State with specificity the statewide necessity justifying the restriction. Be no broader than necessary to accomplish the statewide necessity. Contain only one restriction of a power granted herein, relate to one subject, and be considered by at least one committee of each house, which must be publicly noticed, not something that can be just snuck in underhandedly. So, I have to make a shameless plug for, I want to invite all of you to Tampa on October 3rd and 4th. If you love Rethink the City, you'll really, really love CMU. CMU Florida is just a premier organization that deals with all sorts of issues regarding development and how our built environment is and should be made better. And I just wanted to invite all of you to that. Actually, next week already. So, thank you all very much.
Hey, I heard you comment briefly on how Florida counties fit in the structure between home rule and preemption. Because in fact, the charter gives the county the right to preempt on local ones. And there's such a CRA which you discussed. I agree with what you thought on this.
Yeah, there are statutes in the Florida Constitution as well that govern the powers of charter versus non-charter counties. But yes, a charter county can decide if it's going to preempt municipalities within the county. Certain areas that it wishes to preempt. So it can't. One of this is preemption occurs. We do it because we can. We have the votes, we have the power, we can do it.
Well, I bring that up for a specific reason, because it infinite wisdom, have in many cases allowed charters inside counties to regulate the processes and procedures used in their cities, which seems to me, we can learn some of the lessons at home, but we necessarily migrate to Tallahassee, one negotiations.
Can you speak up a little bit? I can't hear you very well.
Well, I guess saying there's this concept of charter county, we're in one, and it has the right to circumvent or freedom a lot of what our local governments, our municipal governments do. Well, in many different ways, but one of the most notable, which both parties discuss, is community development.
If they want to, they can. I'm not sure how else to answer that.
But I don't know, it really requires an answer, just a
Yeah.
comment.
I mean, and you
It's
know,
a comment about where do we start? Do we start here with local
Right.
governments, or do we start with the
well, I mean, you know, my roles in the legislature, right? So that's my focus, but you know, I think it's important as residents who are involved in engaging in local government, right? To shape that, and I think the beauty of local government, municipality as well as county, is that it's the government closest to the people, and with the legislature, and again, it's legislature acting on behalf of various folks, right? Developers, corporations, you know, folks who have, and also sometimes it's lawmakers just with a pet project or a passion. I mean, vegetable garden is a good example. It wasn't, you know, that was one of those pretty contentious bills this past session, and it was a parody of one of the most powerful men in the process, you know. And I will say my twin sister was one of the no Democratic
I saw that.
and she's a vegetarian, so one of my favorite lines from last session was, I love vegetables, but I don't support this bill. But to your point, so, you know, it's all levels are critically important, but I will say that in the legislature, there's, you know, we are working to sort of shift the narrative, because Democrat and Republican local officials will tell you that the use of preemption is just it's reckless right now. It's just outrageous, all the ridiculous stuff they're putting forth. So it's an issue that we, you know, when it comes to our state lawmakers, we need more folks to talk about, because again, that term preemption is really wonky. A lot of everyday people are not thinking about it, but it impacts to direct presentation every little thing about our lives, right? So it's really important that we start talking to our state lawmakers about it.
Now, I'm not sure how many seats it would take to flip the Senate. Might be 5 seats.
It's 17 to 23.
17,
We're not going to be able to
it's
flip
only
it.
your four
Yeah,
seats
there's not
split.
enough open seats
And
right now
then-
to flip it.
Okay, well, let's say at some time in the near, fairly near future, you
Absolutely.
know, if it flips, then if the Democrats are running the Senate, you might see preemption from a whole different perspective. And then suddenly Republicans might be saying, no, you can't do that. This is home rule. I mean, it's people exercise powers because they can. So that's my prediction of the future.
Yeah, I mean, my prediction is, you know, the trick when it comes to, you know, a lot of issues is that regardless of party, the influence of people, of the wealthy and the folks who have means, you know, it often serves the power of everyday people, right, regardless of party. So that's why it's really important that we really shift that narrative and hold all lawmakers to that standard of serving us, not special interests.
So what is?
I want to give Rick an opportunity to sit down to be a part of the conversation if you'd like, unless you want to continue to stand. Yeah. If y'all want to like pull seats up, please. Yes. Okay. Sorry, go ahead, Theo.
What is reasonable preemption? Because not everything that the state or the federal government preempts is necessarily bad. I mean, we make laws in this
Right.
country for a reason. So what do you use to determine what's reasonable and what's not? I mean, I know if it agrees with me, it must be
Right.
reasonable.
I mean,
Isn't that the answer?
Right, it's a good question, and I think the place that the various, you know, nonprofits and advocacy groups that I work with, it's around, you know, a baseline of protections, right? So baseline, our government has a job to keep people safe, right? To protect our local democracy, like that is a responsibility, I would say, of our state government, right? To make sure folks can be engaged at local level, but also to protect folks from discrimination, from danger, right, from all those things. And so, a good example that I mentioned previously was LGBTQ non-discrimination. I mean, updating Florida's civil rights code to include sexual orientation and gender identity is a good form of preemption, because it's our basic civil rights that oftentimes when we put to the local level, we've seen in history not go well, right? Our civil rights should be something that's protected. When the state doesn't act, we bring in the federal government to protect our civil rights, So those type of examples are pretty obvious, but I think some of the more nuanced stuff, when you talk about all the various things that our local governments deal with, some of it's kind of a no-brainer, like why on earth is the state legislature dictating tree you're currently cutting? Like why on earth is that an issue? But other things are a bit more nuanced, and I don't have there's not like a surefire answer to it, but in general, when it comes to environmental issues, public health and safety, civil rights, it's very much setting a bare minimum of protection to make sure everybody there's equity and everyone's safe. And then anything under that,
And yet we don't have a very
we don't.
protection.
We don't. We've got a lot of stuff on, on trees and vegetable gardens.
The legislature reflects, a collective wisdom and will of whoever's in control. And as I've said before, people will exercise powers because they can. And the power that was retained by the legislature when the Home Rule Powers Act was passed in 1973, I mean, that's part of divided government, checks and balances, if you will. So you can look at it philosophically, like, well, yeah, that's kind of up to them to decide. What is reasonable, what is not reasonable.
We've lost some of our checks and balances in that we have a pretty much one-sided House, Senate, and Governor all in the same sort of place. Whereas, if we're able to convert the Senate, that would give you a little more balance.
10 years from politics is all civil. The state government in Florida is dominated by Democrats for decades and decades and decades. And so, another 10 years from now, Orange County was very much a red county when I first got here in the late 1990s. Now it's a very blue county. And so, think 10 years from now, 20 years from now, who knows?
Yeah.
Things do cycle in and out over time.
They do, but I would argue that I do think we have an opportunity on preemption, to shift the narrative, because I think it is beyond party. I think it's around people over profits. And I think that's a narrative that resonates with voters of all strokes, right? I think once we start really educating folks and talking about it and lifting the veil on who's really in charge in the Capitol, I think voters of both parties, all affiliates, will sort of see this and be stunned by it and be annoyed by it. The Death Star bill is really interesting because a lot of the local, that was a bill that literally every single constituency group was opposed, right? And the sponsor of the bill, couldn't understand it. It was like, why is it every hearing all people are just coming out in this bill? And because it's a terrible bill. And not only did you have the environmentalists and the animal rights people and the LGBTQ groups and the workers all come out and say, this is why this bill is terrible and it's going to harm, the pocketbooks of our communities and the safety of our communities and so forth. But you had the League of Cities, Association of Counties, local government say, we have a fireworks ordinance that our people love, that you're going to repeal, and that our wealthy homeowners in this really elite neighborhood is going to be really pissed about this, right? Horse ordinances. There was this one local government that had an ordinance on they bred the most expensive horse in the country or something here in Florida, and that regulations on their horse breeding industry would have been repealed under that law. So when you really start digging into the weeds of it, everybody's impacted by this kind of stuff. But it's about educating folks and leveraging all those narratives to educate and push lawmakers to understand that this is a nonpartisan situation. Local democracy is important to everybody, regardless of your political affiliation.
They might take a citizens initiative to maybe not do exactly what what was presented to the Constitutional Revision Commission, but something similar to that. Maybe that could be watered down a little bit,
right,
to make it passable.
And Representative Joy Goff-Marcel, it's a message bill, it doesn't move, but she actually filed that bill as one of her bill slots to really leverage that. Senator Stewart has a bill that would ban bans on plastic bags, I think, or something like that. So my sister, Representative Eskamani, has a bill that would move the rent control preemption in state statute, and her chief of staff Alex is here better than anything. And so the other bills that we saw in the past that were really contentious that were preemption issues, the Airbnb, the vacation rental stuff, the scooter bill, all these things. And the Airbnb bill, again, that was so interesting because you had, Airbnb basically wanted a sweeping bill to make it to prohibit local governments from regulating vacation rentals. And some of the core opponents of that was, of course, local governments, but it was also like the Hotel and Lodging Association, right? Which oftentimes is not, may not be an ally with us in different things, but for them, that impacted their profit margin. So some of this stuff is very nuanced and complicated, and you might have unlikely allies in it depending on who's at the table. But no one is saying, like on red light cameras, no one is saying that we have to have red light cameras everywhere, but we're giving local governments the option to have them or not. And if we don't like the red light cameras in our community, we can go to our local government and lobby and advocate against it and make it a campaign issue for city commissioners and county commissioners, right? But it's also a core source of revenue, and yes, the studies on it vary, whether they're health safety or not, and so forth. But a blanket repeal is not, it's not the right solution. Every community should have the options to form a community that reflects their values.
I have a question. I was just wondering what both of your opinions are on Brexit. And no, I'm just kidding. But I actually did want to ask you, I've been really interested with what's happening in the all for transportation sales tax in Hillsborough County, and with both the Florida House and the Florida Senate, I guess coming out with Friends of the Court, amicus briefs or whatever they're called, for the cases in front of the Florida State Supreme Court. I'm just wondering, would you all consider that preemption, or is that it seems like it's not directly because they're not passing a bill, but is that common, or for the legislature to become engaged in a court case question that's trying to repeal a referendum that was actually passed locally? Just seems a little. I'm not familiar of other instances where that's happened, so what are your thoughts on that?
But I think we'll probably answer more. But a few things to note. Oftentimes we see when local governments pass a local ordinance, or tend to, we see it preempted at the state level. So urban sick time is a good example here in Orange County, where we passed it and then the legislature came in before the vote on urban sick time happened. They preempted it, so it actually passed, but it was a moot point because it was already preempted at the state level. We also see that with the transportation tax. So actually, I think Senator Lee put forth a bill that would have preempted the local transportation tax referendums, but it didn't pass. And now there's a lawsuit which the House and Senate have put forth, their letters of support to repealing it.
I haven't read what the ballot would say on that transportation. Has it already passed, or?
So it passed in Hillsborough County.
So it passed. So this is not even the Orange County. So Hillsborough, they passed the referendum, but there are two different lawsuits, and one is the Florida Supreme Court, and both houses of the legislature, I guess, have had their attorneys file a brief in opposition of the referendum.
Yeah.
So it's
and
just.
And the Orange County one has not been perfectly.
Right.
But there's actually several current lawsuits on preemption issues in Florida. There's the transportation tax piece. There's the anti-immigrant bill preemption lawsuit challenging that. And that part of that is there's an unfunded mandate component, which is protected in our Constitution as well. And then there's also, I think it's on plastic bags. There's a lawsuit on that, out of Colt Gables. So you're seeing a lot of these issues challenged.
The Florida League of Cities and some municipalities have sued on the wireless act, on the $150 that you get for saying that the Florida Constitution says you're entitled to, you cannot take property from someone without giving them full compensation for that property. And so we're saying the legislature, or Verizon and AT&T should not be able to take our property, our right of way, away for less than fair market but here, they haven't looked to the Constitution to preempt the ability to preempt.
And like there's a hashtag on the 5G stuff, it's hashtag 5G fiasco, which different local governments are using to really push that because it's absurd what these what they're doing to these towers. And again, for very little compensation.
But I don't really know enough about
Oh, that's okay.
the transportation tax. I've not read.
But the
law.
short answer, I think, though, based on history, is like yes. I mean, the state
It's-
legislature will do a lot to try to preempt local governments, whether
Right.
it's join lawsuits
Right.
or preempt something that's passed or hear about something happening. Again, the predictive scheduling bill that passed in San Francisco, and some legislature heard about it and decided to preempt something that doesn't even exist in Florida yet, which it did not pass, and it also included wage theft preemption in as well. And the other thing that happens a lot with preemption, which is important to note, is the concept of carve out, right? So what you may see on these preemption bills is that there'll be a carve out of maybe a certain municipality or a certain constituency to try to get those folks to sort of lead the fight, right? And so you see that across the country with the LGBTQ community, right? They may preempt having a Death Star bill like House Bill 3, but maybe they will specifically carve out human rights ordinances or conversion therapy bans, for example. Or on the wage theft bill, they actually carved out Miami-Dade. Miami-Dade is a very popular wage theft ordinance that Republicans support, including the chair of that key committee, Senator Ana Flores. So they tried to appease her by carving out Miami-Dade from the wage theft preemption bill, but it ultimately did not work and the bill did not pass. But you see that a lot as well.
I will say, taking money away from public transportation is terrible, terrible public policy.
Yes.
For sure.
That's the one thing I do know about that transportation.
So we're coming to the close. Just want to give everybody an opportunity if there are any final questions that y'all want to ask before we wrap it up.
Right.
I mean, this may be kind of out there, but does Florida need a new constitution? Like we're having a federal structure for Florida, because right now it's just the unitary state. The municipalities and the cities' autonomy exists at the sufferance of the state government. You mentioned that Republicans, as a conservative principle, that the local rule and controls is the best. It's also a conservative principle to want to follow order, so they can follow orders and the lines of governance the way they're written. And right now, the exist is such that it's within that current order, that's okay to do that. So maybe that should be written, so especially for a state such as Florida, it's just so diverse. It's like it said there would be 6 or 7 states rolled into one.
Yeah, but if we tried rewriting it, what would we end up with?
Yeah.
At this
Carefully
point,
asked for.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, I mean, it's a huge question. I mean, and I certainly don't have the answer to that, but when it comes to, oh my gosh, I had a point, I had a thought, but it escaped me, so I'm teaching myself a little bit.
I got a question. The thing that I was puzzled when it comes to the election, when they would these the sub the voter. Like for instance, a couple of years when they had the vote on the solar panels.
Yes.
When it was like, okay, it was to almost to the point where it says, okay, vote yes if you want us to deny this bill.
Right, yeah.
Which if you against it, you're gonna say, oh well, no, yes, I
Yeah.
want it. And when you vote yes, you actually voted against it, and you have to read the word it's okay from it. Why is it illegal for them to do it that way?
Well, so a couple interesting things on that. So, when it's a citizen-led constitutional amendment, so it's petitions that we gather, things like that, the Florida Supreme Court has to approve the language to make sure it's not confusing for voters. But there's other ways to get things onto the ballot, including the state legislature can pass with 2/3 majority in both chambers. They can put something on the ballot, and so that does not have the same rules around language, and you can often see corporations behind those as well. I mean, the solar panel, I'm trying to recall, there was like 2, and one was
One
like
got struck down.
yes,
It
and one
did
got
get
struck down because the language I think was confusing. I think, right? Or something like that.
Well, one
One
protected the power company.
Yeah, but
gave
it
them
was
the
backed by
ability
utility
to
companies, yeah.
control solar.
Yes, yeah,
Mhm.
Because you had to get it through the power
Yeah,
company.
right.
exactly.
The
Yeah.
other one did something completely different,
Yeah.
so.
It's confusing.
Well, one of them didn't pass, and it was funny because the record said like, oh yes, we spent $8.6 million, something like that, to defeat it. And I'm thinking to myself, like, that $8.6 million could be spent on something. If you spend our money just to defeat something.
Right. So the Supreme Court does have to approve that language, I think, but I think in that case it was struck down, and we see that happen a lot. Those conversations happen a lot, but behind a lot of those things, whether it's stopping it or putting things on the ballot, you see the similar actors behind that as well, right? And there's certainly a lot of similarities that we see when it comes to attacks on local democracy versus, citizen-led constitutional amendments, things like that. A lot of the same players oftentimes. What you see is the desire to centralize power in the hands of few, right? And so what are the ways that we as everyday people influence our government? The local government, and also constitutional amendments, right? Where we collect thousands of petitions and we can put something on the ballot. And oftentimes you see those citizen-led initiatives really challenge the status quo. So they also have to build this session to restrict citizen-led constitutional amendments. And it was a lot of the same players that we see behind some of the preemption stuff, trying to essentially impact our democracy at the state level as well. So you see those strands come throughout the legislature.
Well, when I look at the local, everybody's going to do it. On the local level, to me, isn't it the same thing, just like the national level, but on a smaller scale? When you say you have to big lobbies and everything coming and getting in with, even on the local level, when you have for the ordinances and stuff, I go to city council meetings, and I remember I sat in on one in Winter Park, it was there for something else, and I sat in on it, and there was this one lady who was there, older lady, retired all the time in the world, and her complaint was that they kept moving the meetings around, and she can't always get to them, especially when she at the last minute. But the thought occurred to me that, okay, they say that we want the input from the public. But if the only person from the public will show up is their little lady, then are they going to take the public's input, which means they get her input, which means they get an input from one individual who have a motive.
Yeah.
Obviously, and I can't blame her, she has a motive.
Right.
So when they say local rule and everything, so there's a local news packet coming out, and like, who has time for it? Then what happened, the developers, the builders, the local business is the one who comes out, because they're paying somebody to be there.
Right.
And so then their will gets done as, oh, well, we listen to the will of the people, and this is what we came up with.
Because you picked on Winter Park, I have to
So
say.
that's most of this happens in Orlando.
Over Orlando, because I was gonna say, Winter Park, the people are very, very engaged.
They are Winter Park. Yeah, you can see it. Winter Park is real.
It's pretty
It
amazing.
was weird because it said she was the only one from the club. Besides me, the other lady was there.
Yeah.
She was a
No,
lawyer.
you're absolutely correct.
No,
in
that's
that
what happened more often now.
the capacity and the influence of special interest, so to speak, which we name it, right? It's big corporations, it's developers, it's folks who have the resources to invest in folks whose job is to move policies that will support their profits, which they will of course argue, we're creating more jobs in the community, and we are an asset to the community, and sometimes they are, right? There's a lot of nuances in it, but they certainly do have that same capacity at the local level, but it's a lot more what we're seeing at the state level, because the state is less accessible to everyday people, because it's in Tallahassee, right? 4 hours, 5 hours away, 8 hours away.
It's in Georgia, right?
Basically,
Tallahassee and Georgia.
It's southern Georgia. And you have these folks who can, again, rather than having to lobby every single local government, they can focus on 160 lawmakers in one place for 60 days, including committee weeks, right? It's a lot more effective for them to pass a sweeping state law that will, impact every local government versus them going to every local government. Now, they will still be at local government as well, and you see that same corruption and influence at the local level, absolutely. And there are certainly bad actors at the local level as well that need to be held accountable. And we see that. And, the other thing that the legislature loves to do is there'll be sort of one bad actor in one community, and then they will take that and accuse all local governments of doing that. and then pass a sort of sweeping, preemption bill on some sort of really like, on an issue that people will agree, yeah, that elected official is corrupt. They like spent way too much CRA money on something ridiculous, right, or whatever.
Or the city was ridiculous in not letting me take down this diseased tree that
Right.
subsequently crashed on my house and caused all this damage.
Exactly.
So let's just take away all power.
Right, so let's take away, so they kind of use those little opportunities to like really leverage it and demonize local governments. I think great, this is the thing I was gonna say to your point around like the conservative argument that, about what we often talk about around local, small government, emphasizing local government, small government, that's a conservative principle. What you're seeing, the narrative shift on their part, is this idea that local governments are big government, local governments are enforcing, ridiculous policies and they're abusing their power and they turn into local governments and they're really using a big government narrative at the local level now. And so that's something that we need to, address and debunk, right? Because that's very much the narrative we're seeing as they sort of, demonize local governments and kind of surrender like that basic conservative principle around local small government being really
Well,
important.
and they wanna preempt and they wanna take over the running of our schools from our school boards.
Yes, no, and there was, there's already bills being filed right now similar to that, not allowing seniors to be exempted from paying property taxes for schools. We see the sunscreen bill has been refiled. The bill that bans on sunscreens has been refiled this session. So we're seeing a lot of the same fights that we have often. So part of like our vision is, we fight these same fights, but how can we shift the narrative and so that we don't have to fight the same fights over and over again? But you look through
Like different people.
definitely electing different
Well,
people.
that's what I meant by you might actually need to have a federal structure because otherwise you're going to have to do that. Tom, you said it's cyclical. Democrats get in charge again and they become dominant again for decades. They will wish to do the same thing.
Yeah, I mean,
So you'd have to codify.
But I would push back and just say that, if we can start, I'm not saying we don't need to, I'm can't even open that can of worms. I'm not anywhere qualified enough to talk about how to rewrite the Constitution. But, the common thread we see is the influence, right, of the wealthy, of the elite, of corporations in this process. And so if we can start to, disentangle that and to really empower everyday people in our process, in our voices, we'll see a shift and we can end these cycles. At least, I might be a little more optimistic, and let me tell you, in the legislature, like in session, I'm quite jaded, so maybe just the summer's refreshed me. But I think there's, a long game here to shift the influence.
What you
but
see
go back
happening
and
with our laws right now, that's not what I want in the Florida Constitution.
No, I mean if you subdivide the state to a federal structure, each sub-state then would determine the border. Instead of having to get the government, instead of having the state government do everything. Right now, Florida is essentially basically a unitary state, just like versus France versus departments. France determines stuff at the state level, and they have to be able to obey the ordinances. But why not have the local governments have a relationship with the state government similar to what Florida has with the federal government? Then you wouldn't have to have every single. You wouldn't have to negotiate I'd like that all over.
Well, areas of the state do have influence with state government, just not enough.
It's just not formal. It's not formalized either. As if you were saying local control, but that's the difference is that Florida is not a federal structure. That's not a federal structure. So they can still win arguments like you just said. Oh, the local governments are being big government. Well, they want to have big government there in the federal structure, then they can have.
I'm going to go back to the charter counties as an absurdity. It doesn't seem to concern either of you, concerns me. And the reason I think it's an absurdity is you've got, 15, 20 charter county governments. And they are the ones that basically are the most metropolitan.
That's right.
So we have charter counties in counties where, for the most part, the population lives in cities. And in those counties that are fundamentally controlled by incorporated municipalities, and counties don't even need to be in existence, control, in fact, what occurs inside the city. So the absurdity that we're talking about actually starts at the local level, which is the point I was trying to make before, and the fact that we have home rule power seems to have been ignored when we charter counties to work with the incorporated communities in those counties who like incorporated communities.
Well, and I would argue that the opposite of what you're saying.
So,
That's why we're here.
yeah, so we're coming, we're gonna come to a close. I just want to give y'all each an opportunity, like 30 seconds or whatnot, just to wrap up. If there's any final things you want to add before we close up today's session, and then if anybody has any questions for y'all afterwards, feel free to check in with both Ida and Rick. So, Rick, any parting thoughts?
It's all been said. Really appreciate everyone coming out tonight, and see you next time.
Yeah, same Z's. Just talk to your local lawmakers, urge them to put people of profits on every issue, and we'll see you in the Capitol, perhaps.
Cool. And thank you, everybody, for coming and for your thoughtful questions and for the conversation we've had. And that's a wrap.